In this module, we'll be discussing ethnicity, race, and social inequality. As I mentioned earlier, modules 5, 6, and 7 are focused on you. In module 5, we talked about gender, sex, and sexuality and how it relates to you. This module, module 6, will be talking about ethnicity, race, and social inequality. We begin by reminding you again about the components: social identity, which is how other people perceive you, feel about you, and relate to you, and self-identity, which is your conception of yourself. And we're concerned in this module with how it's influenced by race and ethnicity. So how do we determine someone's race? Most of the time, people will talk about things like skin color, hair texture, eye color, shapes of eyes, nose, lips, and other things that we call phenotypic differences, or those evident traits that are part of the manifest biology, anatomy, and physiology. So the first question we consider is race a matter of biology? Race actually is a social construct. It's constructed differently according to culture. Depending upon the culture one is in, when we go back to social identity, one may be identified as belonging to a particular race. But saying race is culturally or socially constructed is not enough. It gives the impression that race is not real, but race is made very real through the practice of racism. Race goes hand in hand with prejudicial attitudes and repressive social orders. So let's talk about the biological meanings and meaninglessness of human races. Races become naturalized, or what people believe to be the natural order of things. The strategies for categorizing humans into racial groups all fail to describe actual individuals and do not characterize entire groups of people. Biological and genetic features vary in a continuous fashion and don't correspond to the racial categories Americans are used to recognizing. And we also have to acknowledge that race does have biological consequences, however. While racial groups are not biologically real, they can become biology due to disparities in access to health care, certain diets, and exposure to certain diseases. Let's talk about some definitions. Racism refers to repressive practices, structures, beliefs, and representations that uphold racial categories and social inequality. Discrimination refers to negative or unfair treatment of an individual because of membership in a particular social group or category. It's interesting to note that avoiding talking about race or racial refusal is a silent form of racism in itself. Which brings us to microaggressions, which are everyday instances of racism, homophobia, sexism, ageism, ableism, etc. Understanding prejudice. Prejudice is taking arbitrary features and assigning qualities of social superiority and inferiority to those qualities. The markers of these qualities can be multiple and overlapping, which brings us to another definition: intersectionality, which is an interplay of race, class, gender, sexuality, and other identity markers in the expression of prejudicial beliefs and discriminatory actions. So what about those phenotypic differences that we talked about earlier that people often use as markers to identify race. Modern humans began migrating out of Africa some 70,000 years ago. As we spread across the globe, populations continually bumped into one another and mixed their mates and genes. As a species, we're simply too young and too intermixed to have evolved into separate races or subspecies. But what about physical differences? In a virtual walk from the equator to northern Europe, characteristics vary continually. So exploring more of the idea about physical differences, we also learned that most traits, whether skin color, hair texture, or blood group, are influenced by separate genes and thus inherited independently one from the other. Having one trait does not necessarily imply the existence of others. Racial profiling is as inaccurate on the genetic level as it is on the New Jersey Turnpike. We also learned that many of our visual characteristics, like different skin colors, appears to have evolved recently after we left Africa. But the traits we care about, intelligence, musical ability, physical aptitude, are much older and thus common to all populations. Geneticists have discovered that 85% of all genetic variants can be found within any local population, regardless of whether they're Poles, Hmong, Fulani, or some other group. Skin color is really only skin deep. Beneath the skin, we are one of the most similar of all species. Certainly a few gene forms are more common in some populations than others, such as those controlling skin color and inherited diseases like Tay-Sachs and sickle cell. But are these markers of race? They reflect ancestry, but as we know, that it's not the same thing as race. The mutation that causes sickle cell, we learned, was passed on because it was conferred as a resistance to malaria. It is found among people whose ancestors came from parts of the world where malaria was common, such as Central and Western Africa, Turkey, India, Greece, Sicily, and even Portugal, but not Southern Africa. So they reflect ancestry, but they are not markers of race. So let's talk about the one-drop rule. We first start by defining descent, which is social identity based on ancestry. So what was the one-drop rule? The one-drop rule was a social and legal principle in racial classification that was historically prominent in the United States, asserting that any person with even one ancestor of sub-Saharan ancestry, or the one drop of black blood, or Negro in historical terms, is considered to be black. This concept evolved over the course of the 19th century and became codified into law in the 20th century. It was associated with the principle of invisible blackness, and it's an example of hypodescent, the automatic assignment of children of a mixed union between different socioeconomic or ethnic groups to the group with the lower status. That is, children are assigned to the same group as the minority parent. So what about ethnicity or common descent? Ethnicity refers to membership in a group with a particular history, social status, or ancestry. So how did European ethnics become white? You might be surprised to know that when Italians first arrived in the United States, Anglo-Americans considered them as racially inferior. They were neither black nor were they fully white, but over time they gained acceptance as being white. And what changes made this possible? There are several historical things that happened, including some court decisions that made this possible. In talking about theories of inequity and inequality, we have to first look at power. Power is the ability to have control, authority, or influence over others. And that is in contrast to agency, which is the capability to act and make decisions. This visual representation shows the difference between equality, or providing the same resources to everyone even when needs differ, and equity, or providing resources according to people's needs. In a truly just society, the third panel, all individuals can be treated equally with no additional accommodations. Gender and patriarchy. Patriarchy is a system of social inequality based on gender. Anthropologists show connections between gender and patriarchy, poverty, and race. You likely have heard the term critical race theories in today's political climate and the cultural wars that are involved in this. But what exactly is critical race theory? It was developed by legal scholars in the 1980s. It identifies racism as endemic, found in laws, policies, and institutions. It is an important part of the evolution of theories of social inequality. Critics see it as one-sided. Advocates see it as vital for raising awareness of social inequalities that support social hierarchies. Economic hierarchy in capitalist societies. Class is a group of people with the same social economic status and proximity to power. Capitalism is a system that produces classes. While most Americans think of themselves as middle class, significant disparities in wealth and privilege are based on the social position a person is born into. Even if an individual born into poverty becomes rich, it is still difficult for them to be accepted by other rich people. This is what you oftentimes hear referred to as old money versus new money. Caste is a system of social inequality based on an individual's circumstances of birth. People are unable to move out of their social group. Examples would be caste systems in both India and Latin America.